Hi, everyone. I see that people are coming in. We're so glad to have you here for today's program. My name is Shay Corey, and I serve as the programs manager for the DC Preservation League. I'm joined today by our fabulous presenter, Dr. Derek Musgrove, and by my coworker, Zachary Burt, who is running the live stream on Facebook. For those of you who may be new to DCPL, we are Washington, D.C.'s citywide nonprofit founded in 1971 that is dedicated to preserving, protecting, and enhancing the historic built environment of the nation's capital. I have just a few things to go over today before we get started. I'd like to start by taking a moment to acknowledge some of DCPL's top financial sponsors whose financial support helps underwrite free programs like this one today. They're the DC Commission on the Arts and Humanities, QTAC Rock, Douglas Development Corporation, Atlantic Refinishing and Restoration, Antunovich Associates, Buyer Blender Bell, AHT Traceries Inc., and KCE Structural Engineers. Thank you all for your dedication to historic preservation in DC. So moving on, just a few notes on how our webinars typically run. If you have a question, please use the Q&A box that's found at the bottom of your screen, and we'll go through those towards the end of the program. Please submit your questions. We would love to answer them for you today. The chat will not be available during the presentations, but I'll turn that on for the discussion period. It can kind of be distracting, so we normally turn it on towards the end. For those joining on Facebook, Zach will be monitoring questions that you might have, and he'll send those to us here on Zoom. We're excited about today's program. In 2020, the DC Preservation League received a $50,000 grant from the African American Civil Rights Program as administered by the National Park Service to fund the creation of a study entitled Black Power in 20th Century Washington, D.C., a Context Study. Written by historian George Derek Musgrove with Sarah Schoenfeld and Nikita Reed, this study explores the DC Black Power movement in all of its diversity. So today we'll be hearing from Dr. Musgrove, who is an associate professor of history and Africana studies at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County. He's the author of Rumor, Repression, and Racial Politics: How the Harassment of Black Elected Officials Shaped Post-Civil Rights in America, and co-author with Chris Myers-Ash of Chocolate City, History of Race and Democracy in the Nation's Capital. His work has appeared in the Washington Post, National Public Radio, New York Times, and The Root. He's currently working on a book project tentatively titled We Must Take to the Streets Again, The Movement Resurgence in Conservative America, which explores the burst of Black activism that rose in opposition to the urban crisis and the conservative retrenchment in the 1980s and 90s. He earned his PhD from NYU, and he lives with his wife and sons in Washington, D.C. Thanks, Derek, for being here. We're really excited for your presentation, and we appreciate your work on this project, and we're really glad that it has gone through in light of recent events, and thank you for being here.
Well, thank you, Shay, for the introduction and for the welcome. And good afternoon, everyone. Please give me a moment as my my screen catches up with me here, but I want to get my slides all situated, and then we'll jump in. There we go. Okay. So I'm going to be presenting from the NPS study that I did with DC Preservation League, of course, and also from a website and the data from that was part of that website that undergirds the study. And to start all that off, I want to begin with this picture. The picture is from May 26, 1979. It was taken in the district building. You can, of course, see Marion Barry on the left-hand side of your screen, resplendent in a summer suit, and newly inaugurated as mayor just a couple of months before. And the gentleman to his right is Kwame Ture, previously known as Stokely Carmichael. He is a Third World revolutionary. He's actually a founder of the All African People's Revolutionary Party based in Guinea, West Africa. And he is in town for the 7th annual African Liberation Day rally and parade, which takes place in Malcolm X Park. But he and Barry are old friends. They were members of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. They had worked as Black Power activists on the streets of Washington, D.C. in the late 1960s. So they had known each other since they were college students. And for those of you who know about Kwame Ture, you know he's very much a cut-up. He was a wonderful firebrand type of speaker, but he was also sort of a clown in his personal interactions with people. And so here he is, this Third World revolutionary, coming to Washington, D.C., and bumping into his old friend. And the first thing he does when Barry walks into the room is he sort of steps back and goes, "My leader," as though he was a communist of some sort. And this could only happen in Washington, D.C. D.C. was the first major American city with a Black Power veteran as its mayor. It was one of the few cities in the country that hosted an African Liberation Day consistently for the latter quarter of the 20th century. And of course, it was a place that hosted institutions like Howard University, where Stokely Carmichael was a regular lecturer and visitor, and a government that was very unabashedly Black and influenced by the civil rights and Black Power movements. And that's really a testament to the power and the breadth of the Black Power movement in the city. So let's get into that movement and how we got a picture like this one in the late 1970s. As I mentioned, I'm going to be presenting from my website, and I encourage you, if you're interested, to do any following up that you want with the website. It can be found at blackpowerindc.umbc.edu. And it is a two-part website. On the right-hand side of your screen, you see that there's a narrative that sort of lays out the larger arguments I'm going to be making in the presentation today, and also gives you a through line for the Black Power movement, which on the website I conceive of very broadly as stretching from the early 1960s to the late 1990s. Today, we'll focus on the 60s and 70s. But then what I also try to do is to situate the Black Power movement on the cityscape. And so you'll see on the bottom left-hand side of your screen that I tried to find the addresses for every major event and organization, the organizational office for Black Power organizations in the district, and then put them on pins on a map of the cityscape. And so you get a really good sense from the website of where the Black Power movement took place. Unfortunately, I couldn't do a proper time lapse, so you couldn't see the movement actually move across the cityscape the way I wanted to. Oh, whoops, that's the wrong direction. I'm going to argue the following in my presentation. First is that Washington, D.C. was a national center of Black Power organizing. When we think about Black Power, we tend to think of Newark, New Jersey, and Amiri Baraka, or Oakland, California, and the Black Panther Party, Chicago and the Black Panther Party there as well. But we tend not to think of Washington, D.C. as this major center of Black Power organizing. And I think that's just flat out wrong. If you asked any Black Power organizers, including the ones I just mentioned, the Black Panthers, Amiri Baraka, they all came here because they knew that there was a huge and very active Black Power movement in this city. They also knew DC was a very important place to establish oneself as a Black Power activist because it had a 500,000 strong Black population. And of course, it's also the capital of the United States. Second thing I'm going to argue is that the huge amount of war on poverty money that was spent in the district that went directly from the federal government to local organizations, because you really didn't have the mediating influence of a local government for much of the Black Power period, creates this broad and dense and very radical Black political leadership in the city. It does that in a lot of places, but not on the scale as in DC. And I'll point this out later, but the war on poverty was directly employing about 1,500 activists at its height in the early 1970s. And so you're talking about a lot of people that consider themselves Black Power activists that are on the federal payroll. And the last thing I'll argue is that the Black Power movement changed over time from one dominated by radicals and street activists to one where a lot of those radicals and street activists become besuited government officials. So the movement actually takes over, creates and then takes over the government here in DC. Remember, the Black Power movement starts in the mid-1960s. It's through the activism of that movement that we get a home rule government in 1974. And then a lot of those activists go into the home rule government or begin lobbying, found their own community development organizations and the like. And so those are my three arguments. In the NPS study that I worked on with DCPL, we laid out 9 themes that would allow us to advance those arguments. And they are War on Poverty Organizing, Black Women's Activism, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, the Black Arts Movement, Black Student Activism in Independent Schools, Self-Defense, Labor, Pan-Africanism, and then the movement becomes the government. And so what I'll do for the rest of the main part of my presentation right now is I'll show you just some wonderful period piece pictures illustrating each of those themes and give you a little bit more background on each before we pivot to a discussion of Pride Incorporated. So to settle everything up, to even understand why there would be a Black Power movement in Washington, D.C., you have to understand the context of early 1960s D.C. And the context of early 1960s D.C. is really this. It's huge Black in-migration and huge white out-migration. So the city is largely desegregated by law in the 1950s. By the time the civil rights movement really begins in earnest in the Deep South, DC, on the books at least, is thoroughly desegregated by the mid-1950s. And so you can't have restrictive covenants to keep neighborhoods separated by race by the mid-1950s. After Bowling v. Sharp, you cannot have segregated schools. After a couple of other cases, you can't have segregated workplaces, public accommodations, etc. The law is no longer on the side of segregationists by the time that we get to the mid-1950s. And for a lot of white DC residents, that was unacceptable. That was not the promise. That was not what they were offered by the federal government and by local authorities, what that we had during that time. And so they left. They left for Maryland and Virginia, which could still promise them those things in the suburbs. And the scope of their leaving is really quite remarkable. Between the end of World War II and the 1970s, about over 300,000 white DC residents leave the city, and you can see that depicted in the orange line on the graph here. At the same time that they are leaving, a roughly equal number of African Americans are flooding into the city. And they're doing so in part because they can't go to the suburbs. Huge numbers of African Americans are heading out of the South as the sharecropping economy collapses. And they're moving to big metropolitan areas like Washington, Philadelphia, Baltimore, et cetera. But they are primarily barred through the practices of real estate agents, by the private practices of homeowners associations, things of that nature, for moving into the suburbs. And so they pack into the center cities. And so you see this huge X in the demographics of the city in the 1950s. And by 1957, DC becomes the first major American city with a Black majority in the United States of America. At the same time that this is happening, there's a consistency in the governance of DC. And that is that it is run by 3 commissioners appointed by the president, all white men. And those commissioners are overseen by committees in Congress, which are typically dominated by segregationists. A segregationist that dominates the committee in Congress that oversees the district in the House of Representatives is John McMillan of South Carolina. He is an unreconstructed segregationist, freely uses the word Negra to talk about African Americans in his conversations with Washington Post reporters, and admits that he is interested in maintaining segregation in the nation's capital as a way to protect it across the South, where it's under threat from the civil rights movement. The other person who's in charge of a DC committee in Congress is Senator Robert Byrd, who I think many of us know as that white-haired, kindly old man that was sort of a mentor to Barack Obama. But in the 1920s, he was a member of the Ku Klux Klan. And while he renounced the Klan, he really never renounced the basic ideas of the Klan, and that is that African Americans should not have the force of the federal government put behind their rights, and therefore create an equal playing field between them and their white fellow citizens. And And both of these individuals not only try to maintain segregation in the city, but they actively use the city as a jobs program for their constituents. And so the police force, teachers, city bureaucrats are full of people from South Carolina and West Virginia who also hold the retrograde racial views of the people who had helped to put them there, John McMillan and Robert Byrd. And so I see the late 1950s, early 1960s as a time of sort of Black population, white power in the district. And that means that someone has to shift this situation, actually find some type of power for the Black majority in the city so that it can claim the promise of the civil rights movement, not just have it there on paper, but not in reality in people's lives. And what you see happening in the early 1960s is the sort of the coalescence of three things that allow for the creation of a sort of Black power movement in the district by 1966. The first is that Malcolm X, who spends a lot of time in the district in the early 1960s, his ideas of Black self-determination, Black self-defense, and Black self-love become widespread among young people and working class people in the district. And you can see this is a picture of him debating Bayard Rustin at Howard University in 1961. Second thing that happens is that a good close friend of Malcolm X named Julius Hobson begins to spread his idea of a very provocative and disruptive protest politics that he brings to his activism as part of the organization Associated Community Teams, which he actually founds with Malcolm X in the mid-1960s. And so you can see him standing next to his car, which was a station wagon that he had turned into a sound truck, which was, part of his activism in the city. And so you've got these ideas of assertive Black self-determination, self-defense, and self-love, a politics where folks are determined to be very forcefully claiming their rights. And then the last thing that you get is the federal government actually funds a lot of this politics and a lot of these ideas by initiating the war on poverty. And that's the picture that you have at the bottom of the screen. That starts in 1965, and it allows all of these street activists who had adopted these ideas, who had adopted this style of politics, to then have a means of support working for the federal government. And then they're able to focus on activism and spread this new politics to the Black majority in the district. So by the time that we get to 1965, 1966, I should probably go back so as not to distract you. In 1966 is, of course, the year that Stokely Carmichael famously gives introduces the theme of Black power to the Southern Civil Rights Movement during the Meredith March Against Fear in Mississippi. By the time he does that, local activists had already adopted many of the ideas and protest strategies that would be at the core of what we would call Black power politics. And they were beginning to spread them around the district. And so even though everyone is finding out about Black power in the summer of 1966, back here in DC, folks are already doing Black power when it comes to pushing for an assertive Black self-determination on the streets of Washington, DC. So let's talk about these themes now. So the first one we have is the war on poverty. And I've kind of laid that out. I'm not going to stay on this too long. But the federal government, particularly as American cities are burning in the summers of the mid-1960s, is really quite desperate to do something about the wildly disproportionate level of poverty among inner city African Americans. And so it floods war on poverty money into America's cities. And within just a year or two, what you see in Washington, D.C. is that people are able to build a really dense institutional infrastructure with this money. The specific infrastructure that you're looking at here is the Anacostia Community Museum, which was founded as a specific effort to pull African Americans into the collections of the Smithsonian Museum in their neighborhoods. And of course, John Kennard, who's the gentleman in the middle of the picture, is featured there. This was their old address right on Minnesota Avenue. Now they're up on the hill near the Frederick Douglass House. But not only had Black Power activists used this money to create things like a community museum, they had created community control of the police boards, independent schools, plans for a government for the District of Columbia, all of these different things using this money. And folks would sort of play those plans out over the course of the next couple of years. Now, a second theme is Black women in the movement. And this is a picture of the Citywide Welfare Alliance. You can actually see Etta Horn. It's really hard to see her. I won't try to have you find her, but Etta Horn was the leader of the founder and leader of Citywide Welfare Alliance. She was a welfare recipient who grew up in Anacostia. And the Citywide Welfare Alliance was one of the most active advocates for welfare recipients, public housing residents in the city. It was led almost exclusively by poor African-American women. And I'm focusing on class here because when it came to women in the movement, there were really sort of two routes into Black Power activism for Black women. The first was through the war on poverty for poor Black women who would found and then lead these organizations that advocated for Black women. And so Etta Horn was, not only a founder of the Citywide Welfare Alliance, but a founding member of the National Welfare Rights Organization, a founder of the Berry Farm Band of Angels. And she dominated these organizations through the force of her personality. That was the case for poor women. When it came to middle-class Black women, what you saw them doing is quite different, which is that they were joining organizations that were really dominated by Black men and asserting themselves through those organizations, but not leading them. And so there was a very different dynamic for the different class groups among Black women, one that you would probably think of as being switched. You would think that middle-class women would be more assertive, poorer women not. It was actually the opposite. This is a picture actually of two of those Black middle-class women that you can see who are coming through sort of a male-dominated organization. Jennifer Lawson and Judy Richardson are on the right-hand side of your screen as founding members of the Drum and Spear bookstore, which was actually the largest Black bookstore in the United States of America in the early 1970s. And it was situated right on Fairmount Avenue and 14th Street in Columbia Heights. I guess that's Columbia Heights. It's sort of in between. And this slide really depicts the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and its impact on the city. The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee is really thought of as a civil rights organization, and it absolutely was that. Founded in 1960, it's the sort of tip of the spear of the Southern civil rights movement. It's all these young, fearless kids who are putting their bodies on the line for voter registration and for the Civil Rights Act across the South. But as the movement ends in the mid-1960s, what you see is that a lot of those young people end up gathering here in Washington, D.C. About 36, roughly, members of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee either were born in DC and they return here, or they move here because it seems like a great place for them to be situated for this next stage in their life. And they are these battle-hardened cadre from the civil rights movement who have pivoted towards Black power. And they end up being the sort of largest and most experienced group within the larger Black power movement in the city, influencing city affairs. And so it's no surprise that people like Marion Barry are coming out of this group. Cortland Cox, who ran Marion Barry's Minority Set-Aside program. Judy Richardson and Jennifer Lawson, who were at Drum and Spear. But all of these SNCC activists are sort of coming into the city and having this massive impact on the Black Power movement here. And they're really doing some amazing things. I'll talk about some of those things for some of the other themes below. Now, a critical element of the Black Power movement is the Black arts movement. I mentioned earlier that Malcolm X's ideas that really are at the core of the Black Power movement are Black self-determination, Black self-defense, and Black self-love. And Black self-love, that last element, in the hands of a lot of the young people who spearhead the Black Power movement nationwide, but especially here in the district, means that folks are going to be focusing on Black art. And the Black Power movement does, in fact, create an absolute profusion of Black art around the country. In the district, that really comes out of two places early on, at least in the late 1960s. The New Thing Art and Architecture Center, which takes federal government war on poverty style money and is really looking to create a Black aesthetic through arts programs, but has an interracial teaching staff, and so it's sort of open for everybody. The other organization that really pushes Black art and stimulates the Black arts movement in the district is the New School of Afro-American Thought, which is actually just a couple blocks down the hill at the corner of 14th and U. And refuses government money because it wants to sort of teach Black people to love themselves and in the process turn them into revolutionaries. And you can't be a revolutionary against the government if you're taking government money, so they argue. And so they're able to build this Black aesthetic, but it's much more overtly political, and it eschews government money. It also leads to them being a lot smaller of an organization, because when you don't have to worry about raising money, you can focus on building your organization. And so New Thing got a lot bigger than the New School. Now, one of the major problems facing African Americans in the 1960s in the District of Columbia was the absolutely abysmal state of the school system. And as African Americans tried to figure out how to address the school system, aside from protesting, they also tried to build alternative models for how the schools would operate. The first thing they try, in league with a lot of liberals in the federal government, is independent schools. Community control of schools. And so the idea is, well, maybe if the community controls the school, not shaping the curriculum, maybe hiring and firing teachers, but certainly being at the table when it comes to running the school, maybe that will increase community involvement, increase student interest, and therefore increase test scores. And that's tried at the Morgan School, which was situated, the actual building, right on the field next to Marie Reed today, the soccer field where it is today. That collapses relatively quickly. There was also an effort to try not just a community control of school, but student control of the school over by Eastern High School. And so the federal government funded what was a student-run Freedom School, which was situated in a Lutheran church on Maryland Avenue and drew most of its students from Eastern. And that too was short-lived, in particular because many of the students who founded it graduated, and also because students have enough trouble being students, they can't also administer their own school and teach their own classes along with just learning what they have to learn. A bit more durable approach to the crisis in Black education were Black independent schools. And so what you saw in places like Lower Shaw were the creation of Black Power style schools like Ujamaa Shule. The building is actually still there. I believe it's on 8th, right below Rhode Island Avenue. And Baba Zulu, who you can see on the left-hand side of the screen with a little leather wallet on his shirt, standing next to the students at the bottom of the stairs, is the founder of the school, a veteran of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. His birth name was Lester McKinney. And he ran that school as a K through 12th grade independent school for over 30 years. He also had a shop attached to it, and so he would sell stuff in the shop, use the money to plow into the school, and then run the school best he could. It just stopped accepting students a couple of years ago, a couple of decades ago, but the building is in fact still there. Now, I mentioned that Black self-love was a key part of the Black Power movement as articulated by Malcolm X, so was Black self-defense. And just like there was a crisis in Black education in the district in the 1960s, there was also a crisis of police brutality in the district in the late 1960s. And it was so bad. I mean, the Evening Star and the Washington Post are actually writing lots of stories about how many, not just Black men, but men, MPD is shooting dead on the street. In the roughly year before the April 1968 uprising, it was approximately 13 people. 13 Black men that were shot dead by the MPD. And this is for things as diverse as potentially stealing a bag of cookies, to jaywalking at the corner of U and 14th and sassing a police officer who tried to stop them when they were doing that. And so, not surprisingly, self-defense organizations crop up in the district. The one that we typically talk about is the Black Panther Party, which is, of course, founded in Oakland. And there was, in fact, a chapter of the Black Panther Party, which had its headquarters right in the middle of Adams Morgan. But the far larger and more enduring Black self-defense organization of the late 1960s was the Black Man's Volunteer Army of Liberation. It was founded by the gentleman that you see on the left-hand side of your screen, Colonel Jeru Ahmed Hassan, the Air Force veteran, who wanted to organize African Americans in Washington, D.C. into a military unit that could go to different parts of Africa and join Africans in their wars for liberation against colonialism. When he realized that that just wasn't possible, he decided to focus his organization on turning it into a neighborhood cleanup group, a security company, and oddly enough, as you can see from the picture on the right-hand side of your screen, a heroin treatment organization. And it was probably one of the largest and most successful methadone withdrawal treatment organizations in the city in the late 1960s and early 1970s. And so even though it had a paramilitary feel, it was really more of a services organization within just a year of its founding. It did, however, do security at events every once in a while. When we talk about cities like Detroit, which was a huge center of Black Power organizing in the late 1960s, early 1970s, labor's at the forefront. And that's because Detroit is a labor city. It's an industrial city. It had large labor unions. It made sense that Black Power activists would organize within that context. You wouldn't think as much about DC because it's a white collar city. However, there was a good deal of Black Power labor organizing in the district. It's just that it took place among either white collar workers or blue collar workers in white collar settings. And so what you had was that primarily the National Urban League, oddly enough, helped to organize sort of labor style groups. You can't call them unions because they were not unions, but labor style groups within a lot of the federal agencies, particularly HUD, in a Solidarity Day protest is pictured here, where Doug Moore, who later joined the city council, is seen at the microphone speaking. And also at places like Walter Reed, where African Americans, not just at Walter Reed, but also HUD and some of these other agencies, were systematically pushed to the bottom of the GS scale. They were, if you looked at the employment at all these different agencies, African Americans are the janitors. They're the GS sort of 1 through 5s, but there's very few African Americans above that. And that was purposeful on the part of some of the management. You also had things like the employee credit union at Walter Reed, which just systematically denied loans to Black workers, even though it was freely giving those same loans to white workers with similar economic profiles. And so these sort of Black caucuses of workers within these organizations demanded equal treatment within these agencies for their Black members as part of the push for Black power in the district. Now, this is our theme number 8, sort of our last one before we get to this big transitional theme. is that, DC is an international city. It's the seat of it's where the State Department is. It's where all of the embassies, most of the embassies are in the United States. And African American activists took advantage of this by making it a site of Black international activism. The capstone for that was African Liberation Day, which was held for the first time in the district in 1972. This is a picture of the crowd of roughly 30,000 that had gathered in Malcolm X Park, marching down the hill, making that right on Florida Avenue and heading towards Embassy Row, where they would protest in front of the Portuguese Embassy, South African Embassy, the State Department, before they held a huge rally at the Washington Monument. And you can find a video of the rally on YouTube. It's well worth a watch for just the diversity of activists that participated in it. And I'm talking about like people from Jack and Jill, like very Black middle class, as well as the Black Panther Party, right? It's a very interesting thing to watch. And just to give you an idea of how enduring this activism is, this protest, African Liberation Day, is held in the last Saturday in May every single year, all the way into the mid-1990s in Malcolm X Park. And so you get this sort of consistency of Black political thought around anti-colonial activism, ending white minority rule in Southern Africa for an entire generation, but it's rooted in the Black Power movement. And the folks who are organizing these protests have a really far reach. I mean, a lot of them are in their 20s, but in the mid-1970s, they organized the Sixth Pan-African Congress. And these are folks who are right out of college, and they organized it out of a row house on Fairmont Street and 14th. So you have, a lot of young activists who are acting on the world stage, interacting with African-American countries as part of their anti-colonial activism. The last thing I'll say is that the Black Power movement in DC kind of didn't go away until the end of the 20th century. And the big reason for that is that in places like, say, Cleveland or Detroit, what you'll see is that the government tries to crush the Black Power movement. Here in the district, what you have is something very different, which is that the movement becomes the government. And I chose this picture very, very advisedly because this is Barry getting sworn in January of 1979 by Thurgood Marshall. You can see him on your left. And Barry is, as I mentioned earlier, the first former Black Power activist to become a chief executive of a major American city. And you see this sort of across the government. He brings all of his old SNCC comrades into government with him. Others get government contracts. Others become lobbyists on the national level. Still others found their own community development organizations. And so the movement kind of embeds itself in DC government. And gives us wonderful things like one of Barry's old SNCC comrades, Tony Gittins, puts together the Pan-African Film Festival, which is run out of UDC all the way into the 1990s. And so people from DC, I can remember in my youth growing up in Baltimore, knew about all this African and West Indian cinema that you couldn't even access in many other cities. But Tony Gittins was bringing that to the Black community in Washington, D.C. And that's because of the impulses that he brought out of the Black Power movement and in his work at places like Drum and Spear Bookstore, where he worked with Jennifer Lawson and Judy Richardson. I'll just end with this. When you're able to jump on the website, what I hope you'll be able to see is the spatial distribution of the Black Power movement. And one of the reasons that I and my collaborators wanted to make sure that you were able to see where the Black Power movement was clustered is so that you could potentially walk those same streets and see a lot of this today. One of the things that I think the folks at DC Preservation League are very conscious of, all of you, is that these areas are not just areas of tremendous state disinvestment in the 1960s. They were the ghetto, right? But today, they're areas of hypergentrification. And so the problem that we face is that the buildings where a lot of this stuff happened that I just talked about were falling apart on the back end of the Black Power movement. And today they're being remodeled, if not torn down, to make way for high-end condominiums, high-end restaurants and things of that nature. And so this is, from a preservation standpoint, an endangered landscape. I hope the map will help you to see that landscape differently than it actually looks today on the street, and to sort of jump into that process of saving some of these places so that we have a better understanding of our past through the built environment. That being said, I know I'm over time, so I am going to really quickly present Youth Pride, which is one of the organizations which we were able to landmark through this context study. And I'm going to do that in like 2 minutes. And so pardon me if I'm rushed here. So Youth Pride Incorporated is one of those war on poverty style organizations that was stood up in DC. And it was arguably one of the more important because it gave us so many really important activists that came out of it. Two of those activists, the two people who really came up with the idea and who were two of the 5 founders, were Catfish Mayfield on the left-hand side and Marion Barry on the right-hand side. And they really embodied the sort of the 2 different major class groups of Black America. Catfish Mayfield was very much a poor street dude, as people called them at the time, whereas Marion Barry was a dissertation shy of a PhD in chemistry, and so one of the most educated African Americans in the country at the time. And they came up with this idea for a sort of a youth organization where young people directed the process of cleaning up their own neighborhoods. They didn't have people telling them how to clean up their neighborhoods, but they sort of came up with the idea of how to clean up their own neighborhoods. And the federal government loved it because it was really, really scared in the summer of 1967 when Pride was founded that the city was going to burn, that there was going to be a riot in Washington, D.C. And so with almost no background, they gave the folks at Pride about $300,000 to try a pilot program in the summer of 1967. And so really quickly, Mayfield, Barry, and their collaborators got a bunch of green denim uniforms for all of these street dudes. They hired about 1,000 people, sent them out into neighborhoods to kill rats, to clean up vacant lots, to repaint people's houses, and basically to clean up parts of the city that had been systematically neglected by those people who had been running the city under the 3 commissioners and congressional oversight. And so Black neighborhoods. And you can see them here sprucing up 12th Street right below what is now Cardozo. Within a couple of months, they got a couple more grants, and they were able to put together a headquarters at the corner of 16th and U Street, which has since been landmarked. This is a Pride building. By the time that happened, Barry and his other collaborators, people he knew from SNCC, people who had a similar educational background as him, began to push Catfish Mayfield out. And this wasn't just a class move. Catfish Mayfield was quite erratic in his leadership style. But what you ended up having happen there was not that the dudes, the people on the block were going to be running the organization, but that middle-class people who were honest to goodness civil rights and Black Power activists were going to be running the organization, and the dudes were going to be their employees. They nonetheless are able to put together some pretty impressive organizations. They embrace the idea of Black capitalism and begin building businesses that the dudes can be employees in. A landscaping business. They put together a savings and loan outfit. After a while, they start buying things like gas stations. This is the gas station at the corner of 14th and Euclid. The gas station's still there. It's, of course, not owned by Pride anymore. And they ended up buying about 6 more around the area. All the dudes are working at the gas stations. The idea is that they sort of learn how to hold down a job in these places, and they move into other industries that don't have as much government support. And so Pride really becomes something of a large concern with significant number of businesses. It's a job training program, but it also is an actual owner of businesses. Um, and then, of course, it's able to catapult its co-founder, Marion Barry, not just into the school board and then onto the city council, but in fact into the mayorship. And this is a picture on the Pride headquarters when Barry becomes mayor in 1979. Of course, playing off of the famous Virginia Slims slogan that was popular among at that time. And Pride is able to stick around for about 4 years into, I'm sorry, 6 years into the Barry mayorship. It folds in 1984 as it's just investigated over and over again by conservatives in Congress who are trying to get rid of war on poverty programs. And early on in these investigations in the early 70s, mid 70s, they found like little minor accounting errors. In a $2 million budget, somebody may have wasted a couple $1,000. But as they get into the mid 1980s, Mary Treadwell, who's one of the co-founders of Pride, actually starts embezzling money from one of their properties. And when they find that in mid 1984, the federal government yanks all of its contracts and Pride folds. And so it has a very unfortunate end. But the key for us, as we were thinking about pushing this forward, is the first property we'd like to have historically landmarked, is that independent of its ignominious end, Pride is really this important incubator for dozens upon dozens of very important Black Power activists. And of course, one of the most influential Black Power activists in the city, and that was Marion Barry. It was also one of the longest lived Black Power organizations in the city's history. I've talked for way too long. Thank you so much for listening. I'll end it here and we can do Q&A.
Perfect. Amazing. Great job. I really enjoyed that presentation, and I think we have some questions for you. So first one for you. How many of the sites on the map that you showed are still standing versus those that have been demolished? Could you give an approximation of maybe, in your research, what has been preserved or what's all gone?
I wish I could. For those of you who know the website Weimer's DC, I was really inspired by that site. It was put together by one of the folks who works at the DC History Center. And it's based on a collection of pictures taken by sort of a federal official in the 1950s who literally wanted to document the entire city in photographs. And this person who works at the DC Historical Center, pardon me, I can't call her name right now, said she's going to go back and use sort of Google Maps to give us pictures of all of those different blocks today and put them side by side. And I thought that is such a great idea, particularly when you're talking about a neighborhood that is threatened. A lot of these sites are threatened with demolition. So I started to do the same thing for this website. And when I realized that I couldn't find software that would properly sustain that, I gave up on it. So I never got a clear indication of how many sites are threatened. What I can say for you is this. As Sarah Schoenfeld and Nikita Reed and I sat down and tried to think of what places we wanted to put forward as our sample nomination for historical landmark status, we really struggled to find an organization that had a huge impact, say, like the New School of Afro-American Thought, that was still intact. So for instance, if you go to the New School location, which is on 14th between V and W, the facade of the building has been ripped open by someone who created it was an Asian fusion restaurant, and then that closed down, and now I'm not sure what it is, but that's off the table, right? The old SNCC office on 14th Street, right across from Ben's Chili Bowl, that's gone. That's where the subway entrance is, right? And you start to tick stuff off, and you're like, wow, we don't have a lot of choices. Southeast House, which is probably the preeminent center of Black Power activism east of the river. The building still stands, but the roof is caved in. And so we settled on Pride as much because it's an important site as that it had an intact building. And so if I could back of the envelope for you, I'd probably say 40, 50%. And but that might be too generous. I just don't know.
Yeah, it is. It can be difficult to be able to tell, and especially with how preservation works, it can be a little bit tricky. Um, are there any planned walking tours of this site, or is that something that may happen in the future?
So I have done walking tours, and it's a little slapdash. I've had people call me and say, can you put together a quick walking tour? And these are like, friends of mine who I'm like, yeah, I can do you a solid. Um, and I would just get a sense of like where they were having lunch and where their bus was going to pick them up, and I'd find 5 sites in between there and there that told a story. So the simple answer is no. I really wanted people to take the website and just use it to walk around on their own. Um, and so, yes, I've done tours, but I don't really want to do a larger and more involved one. In part because I think to tell the story well, you'd have to find a pretty hardy group that would be willing to walk a couple miles. And the other is just because I'm moving on to a new project, and so I just haven't had time to go back and sort of work that out. But I really do encourage people to take the website and lace together a couple of sites that they want to see and walk to them. And what you'll find is that they look very different, but the pictures on the website allow you to see sort of what the area looked like at the time. And so you are able to transport yourself. I should also add that Zach was kind enough to put the context study in the chat. And what I love about the context study is that Sarah and the board that we put together to advise us on Nikki and the board really pushed me to think about themes that I hadn't developed as well in the website, or that were buried in the website, but I hadn't sort of drawn out in the overview essay. And so we have some great pictures in there that are not in the website, of stuff like Human Kindness Day, which was a massive concert down at the Washington Monument. And I mean, tens of thousands of people. Like the pictures are really wonderful. And when that gets shut down, I think in 1975, it's sort of the premier summer outdoor concert for Black DC. A lot of those people end up heading across the river to Malcolm X Day. And it helps you to understand sort of why Malcolm X Day, which was, this sort of radical protest put together in 1972 as the East of the River counterpart for African Liberation Day, why it becomes kind of like the proving ground for go-go bands and really important sort of summer arts festival in the mid-1970s. It's because everyone that went to Human Kindness Day heads across the river. You can get all of that from the context study, I think, in a way that you can't from the website. So I encourage folks to pick up both.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. And there's also DC Historic Sites, which DCPL runs, has a lot of great Black history and kind of affiliated to Black Power tours as well that you can also take independently. So don't be scared to do a walking tour by yourself. You'll learn a lot, and there's a lot of great content out there. Okay, another question for you before we still have time. So could you talk a little bit more about the transition from, kind of this swell of Black Power activism, the election of Marion Barry, into, kind of more modern times, how or why some of those fell out, and kind of if anything has taken their place in, the 21st century?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, that's a great pivot to my sort of new project. So what I do in the website that I don't do in the historical context study is I talk about what I call the Black Power resurgence of the 1980s and 1990s. So what you see in the late 1970s is that the radical activists kind of decline. They're being harassed by the cops and by the FBI. They're engaged in these really ugly sectarian conflicts between each other. Nationalists versus Marxists is a really ugly fight where, people who had founded organizations together are trying to destroy each other's careers by the late 1970s. And so the radicals decline. The more liberal folks and the moderates find their way into government. People like Marion Barry. I think a lot of people think of him as a radical, but among Black Power activists, he's really on the more on the right side of their political spectrum. And it seems like the movement's over, and now we're really just talking about Black elected officials. But the problem is that right when that process occurs, the bottom drops out of the US economy. And so we have the tremendous recession of the late 1970s, early 1980s. And the enemies of the civil rights and Black Power movement get control of the federal government. Ronald Reagan, who literally made his career in California attacking the Black Power movement, attacking the New Left, is the president starting in November 1980. And so what a lot of those Black Power activists who had sort of just demobilized here in the district and around the country realizes that we got to get the band back together and get on the road. And so they initiate a whole new set of protests. They build a whole new set of protest organizations. They reinvigorate old organizations, and they stage what I call a Black Power resurgence. And a lot of it happens in the district and is facilitated by the district government. So in 1983, a lot of these people staged the 1983 March on Washington, which is about 100,000 people larger than the 1963 March on Washington. In 1984, here in the district at the DC Convention Center, Jesse Jackson tries to reassemble that old coalition that Martin Luther King had built in the 1960s and launches his campaign for president. 1985, the Free South Africa movement holds the longest continuous protest since the Montgomery bus boycott, with the Free South Africa picket outside the South African embassy. And hundreds of DC residents, students, professionals are going to the South African embassy to get arrested for over a year in protest of the Reagan administration's support of apartheid South Africa. And this goes on all the way through the Million Man March in 1995, which I want to be clear, the district government was critical in helping to pull off because Farrakhan and the people he had putting the march together were really disorganized. And so it's Barry and a lot of the other people in the district government. Barry's back, of course, after being in jail, that are able to sort of help him pull that off. And after the Million Man March, it all sort of collapses. Farrakhan kind of takes it in a weird direction and people walk away. But for about 15 years, all those activists get back together and sort of head back out into the streets. What you see on the back end of that is a rise of sort of post-racial elected officials. It's people who want to sort of define themselves as not Farrakhan, as not Jesse Jackson. And that's folks like Adrian Fenty and Barack Obama. And then when folks realize that those folks are great for getting into office, but they're not really great for solving the problems of things like police brutality, a lot of younger activists staged the Black Lives Matter movement, which is much shorter in duration, but draws in probably the largest number of white people of an African-American protest movement in American history. But unfortunately, we have a backlash from that as well, which is the Trump administration. And so we're due for another one. We'll see if that actually happens. But there's no question that there's a continuing need. And in waves, African Americans have attempted to fill that need with varying levels of success. There's another need now. It's a question of who's going to step up.
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and I'll end with this question, and you don't have to answer it if you don't want to. But I know you study activism, and you've studied it for a long time now, and you're continuing to study it. Do you have any I don't know, suggestions, words of encouragement for the times that lie before us, in terms of community activism or, you know, being involved, trying to encourage people to do something.
Sure, sure. Uh, yes. So I'll do the don't despair comment first, and then I'll do the but make sure you do this comment second. First, don't despair. Um, and I don't mean this to be trite or to be dismissive, but we've been here before. I remember when Trump was elected in 2016. I had to give the MLK Day remarks in Baltimore in 2017, right after he was inaugurated. And I said, look, this looks just like 1967. And I started reading from a lot of interviews by Martin Luther King. And, Martin Luther King, what was so his gift, particularly as the Black Power movement is starting and folks are angry, his gift was this profound sense of hope, I think, which can only come from a preacher, right? It can only come from someone who's anxiously awaiting the return of the Messiah. And he was constantly sort of bringing people back from despair and saying, no, we can recreate this country in the image of the beloved community. In 1967, you didn't really hear that a lot from King. When after Lester Maddox, a stone cold segregationist, was elected governor of Georgia, he just said Georgia's a sick state. As Nixon is beginning to move towards the presidency. He just said, the white backlash is a consistent element of American politics, and I fear it will be with us for a very long time. I mean, you didn't hear the hope there, and that's because we were dead in the middle of a moment of backlash. And I guess I bring that up because this has happened before, and folks have been able to figure out how to push back. And the beauty of history is that it's this massive trove of information that helps us to figure out how to deal with like situations, not the same situations, but like situations. And we have a lot of precedents for our current moment in African American history. And so we can mine that for strategies to move forward. Now the Debbie Downer part. The first couple of weeks of the current Trump administration look frighteningly to me like the first couple months of the Reagan administration in 1980. It's a very tight election, very deeply divided country. And nonetheless, an arch conservative comes into office, claiming a mandate and focusing his efforts to roll back the regulatory and the welfare state on African Americans. But nonetheless, hurting much larger groups of people, but trying to justify it by focusing on African Americans. And you could add, in Trump's case, trans people and other minority groups. And what's so exciting and invigorating about when Reagan did this in the early 1980s is that civil rights organizations mobilized, created a plan for how to build a counter majority, and then executed. And they said, look, he's focused on us, but he's trying to hurt all these other groups. And so what we're going to do is we're going to build a progressive counter coalition. And it's going to pull in religious groups, feminists, labor, environmentalists, anti-nuclear activists, and we're going to build this counter majority. And Reagan comes in planning to get rid of the Voting Rights Act. It's actually in his papers. Strom Thurmond comes in as the chair of the Judiciary Committee and says, we're going to actually repeal the Voting Rights Act. And by 1982, that counter coalition had actually pushed through Congress a strengthening of the Voting Rights Act, right? I mean, talk about jujitsu. what's scary about the current moment is that Ronald Reagan is doing the exact same thing. But when it comes to African American history, the organizations that were there to sort of build that counter mobilization against Reagan really don't have the heft that they used to. And so we've heard very little from the head of the NAACP. The National Council of Negro Women is not the same organization it used to be. Same with the National Urban League. And you can start to tick through. Jesse Jackson has lost his voice and is sort of quieted by Parkinson's. And Rainbow Push isn't the organization it used to be. And so the organizational infrastructure that African Americans used to create this counter majority and push back against Reagan has atrophied. And so what I encourage people to do when they're sort of, okay, we're not going to despair, but like, what do we do as just individuals? As I say, join an organization, reinvigorate those organizations that were at the core of pushing back against Reagan and create a counter majority against Trump. And it should not be in the Democratic Party. It should be in organized labor. It should be in feminist organizations, environmental organizations. And that's where the fight back will come. And the creation of that robust civil society may put a little stiffness in Democrats' spine, which they really need right now. But we have to start by joining those organizations, something that we're just not used to doing in this atomized, sort of social media-ized moment. But nobody has ever changed the world by themselves. You do it with other people through the organizations that you build. So everybody go get their membership cards.
I love that. I think that's a great place to end. And I think I have nothing else to add to that, those statements. But I will send out an email to everybody with additional resources about Dr. Musgrove and his current projects that he's working on, so that you can stay up to date on that, and links to the website, the context study, all of that great stuff. But thank you so much for being here, Derek, and thank you to everybody who attended. I hope you enjoyed it, and we will see you all soon in our next webinars. But thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you, Shay.
Thanks.